The Hammer and Sickle, a colossus born of revolution. Have you ever wondered about a nation that defied the world, a colossal empire born from revolution, stretching across nearly one-sixth of the Earth's landmass? Imagine a society that promised a utopian future of equality, yet inflicted unimaginable suffering on its own people. A state that launched the first satellite into space and put the first human in orbit, yet struggled to provide basic necessities for its citizens. This is the story of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union, a grand experiment that for 74 years stood as a global superpower, a formidable rival, and a source of both inspiration and dread. How did such a powerful entity rise from the ashes of an ancient empire? What were the hidden truths behind its monumental achievements and its chilling secrets? And what ultimately led to its astonishing, sudden collapse? Join us as we unravel this complex and compelling saga, a narrative woven through the lives of millions, the decisions of powerful leaders, and the relentless, often brutal, march of history. Prepare to be fascinated by the rise and fall of a colossus that changed the world forever. Part 1. The Seeds of Revolution, Early 20th Century to 1917. Our story begins not in the Soviet Union, but in the Russian Empire, a vast realm ruled by the Romanov dynasty for over 300 years. As the 20th century dawned, Russia was a land of stark contrasts, a society teetering on the edge of profound change. On one hand, it possessed immense natural resources, vast reserves of coal, iron, and oil, and a burgeoning industrial sector, particularly in its western cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. New factories, often funded by foreign capital, churned out textiles, machinery, and armaments, creating a growing urban working class. On the other, the vast majority of its population, numbering well over 100 million souls, were impoverished peasants, many still living under conditions not far removed from serfdom, which had only been abolished a mere 56 years prior, in 1861. They toiled on small plots of land, often struggling to feed their families, and harbored deep resentments against the landowning aristocracy. The Tsarist regime, an autocratic monarchy, clung to power with an iron fist, resisting calls for political reform and social justice, believing in its divine right to rule. Any dissent was met with brutal repression by the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police. Discontent simmered beneath the surface, a cauldron of grievances waiting to boil over. Revolutionary ideas, particularly those of Marxism, which preached the inevitable overthrow of capitalism by the proletariat, found fertile ground among disillusioned intellectuals, the increasingly organized factory workers, and disaffected peasants. Groups like the Bolsheviks, a radical faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, led by the charismatic, fiercely intelligent, and unyielding Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, advocated for a radical overthrow of the Tsarist system and the immediate establishment of a socialist state. These revolutionaries operated largely underground, publishing illegal newspapers and pamphlets, organizing strikes, and facing constant surveillance and brutal repression. The year 1905 saw the first major tremor, a dress rehearsal for the revolutions to come. Following a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which exposed the Tsarist regime's military and administrative incompetence, a wave of unrest swept across the empire. On January 9, 1905, a peaceful procession of workers, led by Father Gapin, marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar, seeking better working conditions and political reforms. Instead of an audience, they were met with gunfire from imperial troops, a massacre that became known as Bloody Sunday. Hundreds were killed or wounded. This act of brutality ignited widespread strikes, peasant uprisings, and even military mutinies, most famously on the battleship Potemkin. Though the Tsar managed to quell this revolution through a combination of force and limited concessions, including the establishment of a consultative parliament, the Duma, these reforms were largely superficial. The Duma had little real power, and the fundamental grievances of the people, land, peace, and bread remained unaddressed. The seeds of future revolution were firmly planted. Then came the cataclysm of the First World War. In August 1914, Russia, allied with France and Britain, plunged into the global conflict against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The war proved disastrous for the already fragile empire. Millions of Russian soldiers, poorly equipped, often lacking basic supplies like boots and rifles, and frequently ill-led by aristocratic generals, perished on the Eastern Front. Casualties mounted into the millions, with over 1,600,000 killed by 1917. The war effort crippled the domestic economy. Food shortages became rampant in the cities as agricultural production plummeted and transportation networks, strained by military demands, failed to deliver supplies. Inflation soared, making what little food was available unaffordable for many. The Tsar, Nicholas II, in a desperate attempt to rally national unity, took personal command of the army in 1915, a decision that further eroded his authority. It left the unpopular Tsarina Alexandra under the sway of the controversial mystic Grigory Rasputin in charge of domestic affairs, a situation that bred rumors of corruption and incompetence at the highest levels. By early 1917, the empire was on the brink of collapse. The winter was exceptionally harsh, and bread riots erupted in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg. On February 23, 1917, women textile workers went on strike, demanding bread and peace. Their protests quickly swelled, joined by factory workers and, critically, by soldiers from the Petrograd garrison who refused to fire on the crowds, instead joining the demonstrations. Within days, the capital was in chaos, with widespread strikes and mutinies. Unable to restore order and facing pressure from his own generals who saw his continued rule as a threat to the war effort, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne on March 2, 1917, bringing an end to 304 years of Romanov rule. The ancient monarchy, which had seemed so immutable, had crumbled in a matter of days. A provisional government, composed largely of liberal politicians from the former Duma, took power, promising democratic reforms, civil liberties, and continued participation in the war. However, it failed to address the two most pressing demands of the populace: peace and land. The war continued to drain the nation's resources and lives, and the land question, central to the lives of 80% of the population, remained unresolved. Meanwhile, Soviets' councils of workers and soldiers' deputies sprang up across the country, gaining increasing influence and representing the direct will of the people. The most powerful of these was the Petrograd Soviet, which often challenged the authority of the provisional government. In April 1917, Lenin, who had been exiled in Switzerland, returned to Russia with German assistance, hoping to destabilize the provisional government and pull Russia out of the war. He immediately issued his April thesis, a radical program calling for all power to the Soviets, an end to the war, nationalization of banks, and land redistribution. The Bolsheviks, initially a minority party, steadily gained support, particularly among the urban working class, who were suffering from economic hardship, and soldiers disillusioned by the provisional government's continued war efforts. Their simple, direct slogans resonated with the masses. As the summer wore on, the situation deteriorated further. A failed military offensive in July, followed by an attempted coup by General Lev Kornilov in August, further weakened the provisional government and exposed its fragility. The Bolsheviks, who had initially been suppressed after the July Days uprising, emerged stronger, having proven themselves as a disciplined force capable of organizing and defending the revolution against both government repression and counter-revolutionary attempts. By October, Lenin, sensing the provisional government's weakness and the growing revolutionary fervor, believed the time was ripe for a second, decisive revolution. On the night of October 24, 1917, November 6 by the Gregorian calendar, Bolshevik Red Guards, supported by sympathetic soldiers and sailors from the Kronstadt naval base, launched a coordinated uprising. They swiftly seized key government buildings, railway stations, post offices, and communication centers in Petrograd. The Winter Palace, the opulent former residence of the Tsars and now the seat of the provisional government, was stormed on October 25, November 7th. The provisional government collapsed with barely a fight, its ministers arrested. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, meeting in Petrograd, formally approved the transfer of power to the Soviets. Lenin immediately issued his first decrees, the Decree on Peace, calling for an immediate end to the war without annexations or indemnities, and the Decree on Land, which abolished private land ownership and redistributed land to the peasants. The Bolsheviks, a small but highly organized, disciplined, and determined minority, had seized power in the name of the working class and peasantry, promising a radical transformation of society. The Russian Empire was no more. In its place, a new, revolutionary state was beginning to take shape, one that would profoundly alter the course of the 20th century. Part 2, Birth of the Soviet Union and Early Years 1917 to 1924. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 was not the end of Russia's turmoil, it was merely the beginning of a new, brutal chapter. The decrees on peace and land were immensely popular, yet the Bolsheviks' hold on power was tenuous and contested. They faced immediate and fierce opposition from a diverse array of forces: monarchists yearning for the return of the Tsar, liberals who desired a Western-style democracy, moderate socialists who believed the Bolsheviks had acted prematurely, and various nationalist groups seeking independence. All were united by their desire to overthrow the new communist regime. This ignited the Russian Civil War, a devastating conflict that would rage for over 3 years, from 1918 to 1921, tearing the already ravaged country apart. The opposing forces, collectively known as the Whites, were a disparate collection of anti-Bolshevik armies, often poorly coordinated and lacking a unified political program. They received some material support and direct intervention from foreign powers including Britain, France, the United States, Japan, and even Germany, who feared the spread of communism and sought to protect their economic interests and prevent Russia from withdrawing from World War I. However, these interventions were often half-hearted, geographically dispersed, and ultimately insufficient to turn the tide. The Bolsheviks, or Reds, commanded by the brilliant, ruthless, and highly effective Leon Trotsky, organized the Red Army into a formidable fighting force, employing strict discipline and political commissars to ensure loyalty. They controlled the industrial heartland and the crucial railway network of central Russia, giving them a strategic advantage in terms of manpower, resources, and logistics. The Civil War was marked by extreme brutality and immense suffering on both sides. The Reds implemented war communism, a desperate set of emergency policies designed to supply the Red Army and consolidate state control. This included forced grain requisitioning from peasants, often leaving them with nothing, leading to widespread starvation. All industry was nationalized, and strict labor discipline was enforced, with workers often treated like soldiers. While economically ruinous, war communism allowed the Red Army to be supplied, but it led to widespread famine and economic collapse across the country. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, unleashed the Red Terror, a campaign of mass arrests, torture, and executions aimed at eliminating any perceived enemies of the revolution. Tens of thousands of suspected counter-revolutionaries, priests, former aristocrats, and even ordinary citizens were summarily executed. The Whites, in turn, engaged in their own atrocities, including widespread pogroms against Jews and brutal reprisals against suspected Bolshevik sympathizers. By 1920, the Red Army had largely defeated the major white forces. The last significant white armies were driven out of Crimea in November 1920. The Bolsheviks had won, but at an immense cost. Millions had died from fighting, famine, and disease, with estimates ranging from 7 million to 12 million total casualties, including civilian deaths. The economy was in ruins. Industrial production had plummeted to a fraction of pre-war levels, and the country was utterly exhausted. Recognizing the dire situation and facing widespread peasant uprisings and the Kronstadt rebellion of disillusioned sailors, Lenin introduced the new economic policy NEP in March 1921. This was a temporary, pragmatic retreat from the radical policies of war communism, a necessary step back to prevent total collapse. The NEP allowed for limited private enterprise, market mechanisms, and, crucially, an end to forced grain requisitioning, replacing it with a fixed tax in kind. Peasants were allowed to sell their surplus produce, and small-scale private businesses were permitted. The NEP brought a much-needed period of economic recovery and relative stability. leading to a revival of agriculture and trade, though it was seen by many hardline communists as a dangerous deviation and a betrayal of revolutionary principles. As the Civil War concluded and the NEP began to stabilize the economy, the Bolsheviks began to consolidate their political power and formalize the new state. The various Soviet republics that had emerged from the former Russian Empire were gradually brought under centralized control. On December 30, 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics USSR was formally established, comprising the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Transcaucasian Soviet Socialist Republics. This marked the official birth of the Soviet Union, a federal state ostensibly based on socialist principles, though in practice power was highly centralized in Moscow, controlled by the Communist Party. Lenin, the undisputed architect of the revolution and the new state, suffered a series of debilitating strokes beginning in 1922. His health rapidly deteriorated, and he became increasingly incapacitated, withdrawing from active political life. In his final months, he grew deeply concerned about the growing bureaucracy within the party and the increasing power and ruthless ambition of Joseph Stalin, the seemingly unassuming general secretary of the Communist Party. In his testament, dictated in late 1922 and early 1923, Lenin famously warned against Stalin's ambition and suggested he be removed from his post, describing him as too rude. However, Lenin's testament was suppressed by the party leadership, who feared its implications for stability. When Lenin finally died on January 21, 1924, a fierce power struggle erupted among the top Bolshevik leaders. Leon Trotsky, the brilliant military leader, intellectual, and revolutionary orator, seemed the natural successor, but he was isolated by a triumvirate of Joseph Stalin, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev. Stalin, in his unassuming role as general secretary, had quietly built a vast network of loyalists within the party apparatus, controlling appointments and information flow. He skillfully played his rivals against each other, exploiting their ideological differences and personal animosities, patiently accumulating power behind the scenes. By the end of 1924, Stalin was already on the path to becoming the undisputed leader, though his absolute dominance would take several more years to solidify. The foundational years of the Soviet Union had been marked by civil war, economic experimentation, and the formalization of a new political entity. But the stage was now set for a new, terrifying era, one that would be defined by the iron will, paranoia, and brutal ambition of Joseph Stalin, who would reshape the Soviet Union in his own image, at an unimaginable human cost. Part 3, The Stalinist Era 1924 to 1953. The death of Lenin in 1924 opened the door for Joseph Stalin to seize absolute power, transforming the Soviet Union into a totalitarian state of unprecedented scale. Stalin, a man of immense cunning, relentless ambition, and chilling ruthlessness, systematically eliminated his rivals. He first isolated and then expelled Leon Trotsky from the party in 1927, exiled him from the Soviet Union in 1929, and finally arranged for his assassination in Mexico in 1940. By the late 1920s, Stalin had consolidated his position as the supreme leader of the Communist Party and, by extension, the entire Soviet Union, wielding power far exceeding that of any czar. Stalin's primary goal was to rapidly transform the Soviet Union from a backward agrarian society into a modern industrial and military power capable of defending itself against capitalist encirclement. He launched the first five-year plan in 1928, initiating a period of forced, breakneck industrialization. Gigantic industrial complexes, steel mills, coal mines, tractor factories, and hydroelectric dams were built from scratch across the vast country, often in remote and challenging environments. The focus was overwhelmingly on heavy industry, with consumer goods production severely neglected. Millions of peasants were forcibly relocated to cities to work in these new factories, often under harsh conditions, strict discipline, and meager wages. The state controlled every aspect of the economy, setting unrealistic production targets and demanding immense sacrifices from the population, driven by propaganda slogans like the 5-year plan in 4 years. Parallel to industrialization was the brutal policy of forced collectivization of agriculture. Beginning in 1929, private farms were abolished and peasants were compelled, often at gunpoint, to join collective farms called kolkhozs or state farms sovkhozs. This was met with fierce resistance, particularly from the more prosperous peasants, known as kulaks, who were branded as enemies of the people and accused of hoarding grain. Millions were dispossessed of their land, livestock, and homes, deported to labor camps in Siberia, or summarily executed. The disruption caused by collectivization, combined with punitive state grain requisitioning policies designed to feed the cities and fund industrialization, led to a catastrophic famine in 1932 and 1933, particularly in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. This man-made famine, known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, claimed millions of lives. Estimates range from 3 million to 7 million as the state continued to export grain even while its own citizens starved. Despite the horrific human cost, collectivization provided the state with centralized control over food supplies and a vast, cheap labor force for the burgeoning industries. The 1930s were also marked by the Great Purge, a period of widespread political repression and terror that reached its peak between 1936 and 1938. Beginning with the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a popular party leader, in December 1934, an event widely believed to have been orchestrated by Stalin himself. Stalin unleashed a wave of arrests, meticulously staged show trials, and executions aimed at eliminating any perceived opposition, real or imagined. Old Bolsheviks who had fought alongside Lenin, military leaders including Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and many of the Red Army's top generals, intellectuals, scientists, artists, and even ordinary citizens were accused of treason, sabotage, espionage, and conspiracy. Millions were sent to the Gulag, a vast and brutal system of forced labor camps stretching across the Soviet Union, from the Arctic Circle to the Far East. In these camps, prisoners perished from starvation, disease, exposure, and brutal treatment, often working on massive infrastructure projects like canals and railways. The purges decimated the party and military leadership, creating a climate of pervasive fear, suspicion, and absolute, unquestioning obedience to Stalin's will. No one was safe, and neighbors were encouraged to denounce neighbors. As the 1930s drew to a close, the threat of war loomed large over Europe. Despite deep ideological differences between communism and fascism, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with Nazi Germany, in August 1939. This shocking pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing the Soviet Union to annex parts of eastern Poland, the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Bessarabia, part of Romania. Stalin believed this pact would buy him time to prepare for an inevitable conflict. However, the pact was a temporary and ultimately fatal reprieve. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. This marked the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, a conflict that would claim the lives of an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens, soldiers, and civilians alike, making it the deadliest conflict in human history for any single country. The initial German advance was devastating, a lightning-fast blitzkrieg that pushed deep into Soviet territory, encircling vast armies and reaching the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. But the Soviet people, galvanized by a fierce sense of patriotism, a deep-seated hatred of the invaders, and Stalin's rallying calls for a great patriotic war, mounted a heroic and desperate defense. The vastness of the Soviet Union, the harsh Russian winter, combined with immense logistical challenges for the German army and the sheer scale of Soviet resistance, halted the German advance, particularly at the Battle of Moscow in late 1941. The tide of the war definitively turned with the Battle of Stalingrad, a brutal and decisive engagement that raged from August 1942 to February 1943. This urban meat grinder, fought street by street, building by building, resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the German Sixth Army and marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, now better equipped, more experienced, and increasingly well-led, began its relentless westward push, driving the German forces back through scorched earth. The Soviet Union played a crucial and indispensable role in the Allied victory over Nazi Germany, bearing the overwhelming brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front and ultimately capturing Berlin in May 1945, planting the red flag atop the Reichstag. The end of World War II saw the Soviet Union emerge as one of the world's two superpowers, alongside the United States. Its territory expanded significantly, and it established a vast sphere of influence over Eastern European countries, which became satellite states, forming the Eastern Bloc. The ideological differences between the Soviet Union's communism and the Western capitalist democracies quickly led to the Cold War, a period of intense geopolitical tension, ideological struggle, proxy conflicts, and a terrifying nuclear arms race that would last for over 4 decades. Stalin, now seen as the victorious wartime leader and a figure of immense prestige, continued his autocratic rule, though on a less brutal scale than the purges of the 1930s. He initiated new purges, particularly against perceived cosmopolitans, often a euphemism for Jews, and oversaw the rapid development of the Soviet atomic bomb in 1949, breaking the American nuclear monopoly and further escalating the Cold War into a perilous new phase. Joseph Stalin died on March 5, 1953, after nearly 3 decades of absolute, tyrannical rule. His death brought an end to an era of unprecedented industrialization, unimaginable suffering, and the establishment of the Soviet Union as a formidable global power. The country now faced the daunting challenge of moving forward without the iron grip of its longtime dictator, entering a period of uncertainty and potential change. Part 4, The Thaw and Stagnation, 1953 to 1985. Stalin's death in March 1953 ushered in a period of collective leadership, initially involving Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Nikita Khrushchev. However, it was Khrushchev, a pragmatic, often impulsive, and surprisingly bold leader, who ultimately consolidated power. He initiated a profound process known as de-Stalinization. In a secret speech delivered to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, Khrushchev delivered a scathing denunciation of Stalin's cult of personality, his purges, his abuses of power, and the crimes of the Stalin era. This speech, though initially secret and delivered to a closed session, eventually leaked to the West and sent shockwaves through the communist world, shaking the foundations of Soviet ideology and revealing the true horrors of the past. De-Stalinization led to the release of millions from the Gulag, a significant relaxation of censorship, the thaw, and a greater, though still limited, emphasis on consumer goods and improving the lives of ordinary citizens. Khrushchev's era was marked by both bold reforms and dramatic international confrontations. Domestically, he launched ambitious agricultural programs, such as the Virgin Lands campaign to cultivate vast tracts of steppe, though many proved ultimately unsuccessful due to poor planning and ecological oversight. He also oversaw significant advancements in the Soviet space program, a key arena of Cold War competition. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, a small but stunning technological achievement that shocked the United States and initiated the space race. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting the Earth aboard Vostok 1, further cementing Soviet technological prowess and prestige on the global stage. Internationally, Khrushchev pursued a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, arguing that communism could triumph through economic competition rather than military conflict. However, this policy was often punctuated by intense crises and brinkmanship. The most dangerous of these was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when the Soviet Union secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. For 13 terrifying days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war as the U.S. imposed a naval blockade. A tense standoff was ultimately diffused through intense back-channel negotiations, with the Soviets agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Khrushchev's erratic leadership, his agricultural failures, his perceived humiliation in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and his often unpredictable policy shifts ultimately led to his downfall. In October 1964, he was removed from power in a bloodless coup orchestrated by his colleagues in the Politburo, who had grown tired of his harebrained schemes and unpredictable behavior. He was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, a more cautious and conservative figure who would lead the Soviet Union for the next 18 years. The Brezhnev era, lasting from 1964 to 1982, is often referred to as the era of stagnation zastoy. While there was a veneer of stability, a continued build-up of military power achieving nuclear parity with the US, and a rise in living standards for some, the Soviet economy began to falter significantly. The highly centralized planning system stifled innovation, productivity declined, and corruption became endemic within the party apparatus. Despite being rich in natural resources, the Soviet Union struggled to provide its citizens with basic consumer goods, leading to chronic shortages, long queues outside shops, and widespread dissatisfaction. The relentless arms race with the United States continued unabated, consuming a disproportionate share of the Soviet budget and diverting crucial resources from civilian sectors like housing, healthcare, and consumer production. Brezhnev's foreign policy was characterized by the Brezhnev Doctrine, which asserted the Soviet Union's right to intervene in the affairs of socialist countries to preserve socialism. This doctrine was famously applied in August 1968, when Soviet-led Warsaw Pact forces invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, a period of liberal reforms and attempts to create socialism with a human face. The invasion sent a clear and chilling message that Moscow would not tolerate deviations from its communist model in its satellite states. The 1970s saw a period of detente, or easing of tensions, with the West, marked by arms control treaties like SALT, strategic arms limitation talks, and increased cultural exchanges. However, this period of relative calm was shattered in December 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a struggling pro-Soviet government. The invasion sparked a fierce and prolonged resistance from Afghan Mujahideen, supported by the United States, Pakistan, and other countries. The war in Afghanistan became a costly and drawn-out quagmire, draining Soviet resources, manpower, and morale, often referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed, and the war became deeply unpopular at home. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing a multitude of interconnected problems. Its economy was in accelerating decline, its technological gap with the West was widening, and its aging, conservative leadership seemed increasingly unable to address the growing challenges. Brezhnev's death in November 1982 was followed by two short-lived successions, Yuri Andropov, a former KGB head who died in February 1984, and Konstantin Chernenko, who died in March 1985. These leaders were old, ailing, and deeply entrenched in the old ways, offering little in the way of new ideas or dynamic leadership. The Soviet Union was ripe for profound change, though few, even within the country, could have predicted just how swift and complete that change would be. The stage was set for a new generation of leadership. Part 5: The Shadows of Progress, Controversies, Experiments, and Secrets, 1920s to 1991. Beneath the grand narratives of industrialization, war, and superpower rivalry, the Soviet Union harbored a darker, more secretive side. From its earliest days, the state maintained an iron grip on information, suppressing dissent and controlling every aspect of public life. This pervasive secrecy allowed for the flourishing of scientific and social experiments that often pushed ethical boundaries, and for controversies to be buried beneath layers of propaganda and state control. One of the most damaging controversies was the rise of Lysenkoism in agriculture, particularly from the 1930s through the 1950s. Trofim Lysenko, an agronomist, championed pseudoscientific theories that rejected Mendelian genetics in favor of Lamarckian inheritance, the idea that acquired characteristics could be inherited. His theories, which promised rapid increases in crop yields through methods like vernalization exposing seeds to cold to simulate winter, were embraced by Stalin, who saw them as ideologically aligned with Marxist principles of environmental influence over heredity. Scientists who dared to challenge Lysenko, including leading geneticists like Nikolai Vavilov, were persecuted, imprisoned, or executed. The consequences were catastrophic. Lysenko's methods often failed spectacularly, contributing to agricultural stagnation and exacerbating food shortages, particularly during the famines of the 1930s. This ideological interference crippled Soviet biological science for decades and had a devastating impact on food security. Beyond the political purges, the Soviet state engaged in other widespread human rights abuses. Millions were subjected to forced internal migrations, often on ethnic grounds. For example, in 1944, hundreds of thousands of Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and other ethnic groups were brutally deported from their homelands to Central Asia and Siberia, accused of collaboration with the Nazis, despite many fighting in the Red Army. These forced resettlements led to immense suffering and death. Dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Dissidents were not only sent to the Gulag, but also, particularly from the 1960s onwards, confined to psychiatric hospitals under the guise of sluggish schizophrenia, a diagnosis used to pathologize political opposition. This was a chilling form of political repression, where sane individuals were subjected to forced medication and inhumane conditions. The drive for rapid industrialization and military might also lead to severe environmental disasters, often kept secret for years. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986, though eventually revealed by Glasnost, was initially met with a desperate attempt at cover-up by Soviet authorities, delaying evacuation and denying the scale of the catastrophe, exposing millions to radiation. Less known but equally devastating was the ongoing tragedy of the Aral Sea. Beginning in the 1960s, massive irrigation projects diverted the Amudarya and Syr-Darya rivers to grow cotton in the desert, a key component of the Soviet economic plan. This led to the rapid shrinking of the Aral Sea, once the world's fourth largest inland body of water, transforming it into a vast, toxic desert. The resulting dust storms, laden with pesticides and industrial chemicals, caused severe health problems for local populations and destroyed the region's fishing industry. Industrial pollution across the Soviet Union, from Siberian nickel smelters to heavily polluted rivers, was rampant, often ignored in the pursuit of production targets. In the realm of scientific experiments, the Soviet Union pursued ambitious and often ethically questionable research, driven by Cold War competition and the state's absolute control over its citizens. The space race, while producing iconic achievements like Sputnik 1 and Yuri Gagarin's flight, also had a darker side. The immense pressure to be first often led to a disregard for astronaut safety in the early stages, with rumors of phantom cosmonauts who perished in unacknowledged test flights. Failures were meticulously kept secret, and only successes were publicized, creating a distorted image of flawless progress. The Soviet Union also maintained extensive and highly secretive biological and chemical weapons programs, despite signing international treaties prohibiting them. Facilities like the one in Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, developed and produced deadly agents. In April 1979, an accidental release of anthrax spores from a military microbiology facility in Sverdlovsk led to hundreds of deaths, a disaster that was officially blamed on contaminated meat for years, only to be revealed as a biological weapons accident after the fall of the Soviet Union. The nuclear program was another area of intense secrecy and immense human cost. The urgency to develop atomic and then hydrogen bombs after World War II led to rapid, often reckless, testing. The Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, for instance, was the primary nuclear test site for over 40 years, from 1949 to 1989. Hundreds of nuclear tests, both atmospheric and underground, were conducted there, exposing hundreds of thousands of Kazakh citizens to radiation, leading to widespread cancer, birth defects, and environmental contamination, all while the Soviet government denied any ill effects. Beyond these large-scale programs, there were reports of more disturbing medical experiments, often conducted on prisoners or vulnerable populations, in the pursuit of military or scientific advantage. Details remain scarce due to the secrecy, but accounts suggest research into areas like mind control, drug development for interrogation, and even attempts at human-animal hybridization, though many of these remain in the realm of speculation and unconfirmed reports. Finally, the pervasive nature of secrets and espionage defined the Soviet state. The KGB Committee for State Security was the omnipresent and omnipotent secret police force, successor to the Cheka and NKVD. Its pervasive influence extended into every corner of Soviet life, conducting widespread surveillance, suppressing dissent, and managing a vast network of informers. Internationally, the KGB was a formidable intelligence-gathering organization, playing a crucial role in the Cold War. It was instrumental in acquiring atomic secrets from the West, notably through spies like Klaus Fuchs, significantly accelerating the Soviet nuclear program in the 1940s. The state also engaged in extensive disinformation campaigns and active measures to influence global public opinion, sow discord in Western societies, and promote its ideological agenda. High-profile defectors from the Soviet Union, such as KGB officers and ballet dancers, were rare but significant events, often sparking international incidents and revealing glimpses of the closed society. which the state tried desperately to prevent through strict travel restrictions and surveillance. These hidden stories of scientific hubris, ethical compromises, and pervasive secrecy offer a crucial counterpoint to the official narrative of Soviet progress, revealing the true human and environmental cost of a state that prioritized power and ideology above all else. Part 6: Gorbachev and the End, 1985 to 1991. The year 1985 marked a pivotal turning point in Soviet history, a moment when the seemingly unshakable edifice of the Soviet Union began its final, rapid decline. In March, Mikhail Gorbachev, a relatively young at 54 years old and energetic reformer, became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Unlike his aged predecessors, Gorbachev recognized the deep-seated problems plaguing the Soviet system: chronic economic stagnation, widespread corruption, rampant alcoholism, a stifling lack of freedom, and a growing cynicism among the populace. He understood that radical, systemic change was not merely desirable but absolutely necessary to save the Soviet Union from collapse. Gorbachev introduced two key, interconnected policies that would ultimately unleash forces beyond his control: glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring. Glasnost aimed to increase transparency in government and allow for greater freedom of speech and information. Previously taboo subjects, such as Stalin's crimes, the true extent of economic failures, environmental degradation like the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986, and the heavy human cost of the Afghan war, were openly discussed in the media and public forums. This unprecedented openness, while intended to invigorate society and encourage public participation, also exposed the deep flaws, historical injustices, and systemic corruption of the Soviet system, further eroding public trust in the Communist Party and its legitimacy. People began to question everything. Perestroika focused on fundamental economic and political reforms. Economically, it aimed to decentralize decision-making, introduce limited market elements, allow for small-scale private enterprise cooperatives, and encourage individual initiative, particularly in agriculture and services. The goal was to boost productivity and improve living standards, but the reforms were often piecemeal, poorly implemented, and created new problems like inflation and shortages, exacerbating public discontent. Politically, Gorbachev introduced multi-candidate elections for local Soviets and a new, more genuinely representative legislative body, the Congress of People's Deputies, allowing for more open political debate and the emergence of opposition figures. He also sought to reform the Communist Party itself, though he remained committed to its leading role in society. Internationally, Gorbachev pursued a radical policy of new thinking, seeking to reduce Cold War tensions and the costly arms race, and improve relations with the West. He engaged in a series of groundbreaking summit meetings with U.S. President Ronald Reagan, leading to significant arms reduction treaties, such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty in December 1987, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. Crucially, he also announced that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene in the affairs of its satellite states in Eastern Europe, effectively abandoning the Brezhnev Doctrine. This was a monumental shift, signaling an end to Soviet imperial control. This shift in Soviet foreign policy had immediate and dramatic consequences. Throughout 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions, often called the Autumn of Nations, swept across Eastern Europe. One after another, communist regimes, deprived of Soviet backing, collapsed with astonishing speed and often with little resistance from their own armies or from Moscow. Poland held semi-free elections in June. Hungary opened its border with Austria in August, sparking a mass exodus of East Germans, and Czechoslovakia experienced the Velvet Revolution in November. The most symbolic and emotionally resonant event occurred on November 9, 1989, when the Berlin Wall, a potent symbol of the Cold War division and communist oppression, was torn down by jubilant crowds. Germany was reunified less than a year later, in October 1990. As Eastern Europe broke free, nationalist movements within the Soviet Union's 15 constituent republics gained unstoppable momentum. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, forcibly annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, were at the forefront, demanding full independence. Other republics, including Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and the Central Asian states, also began to assert their sovereignty, demanding greater autonomy or outright secession. Gorbachev tried desperately to negotiate a new union treaty that would grant greater autonomy to the republics while preserving a reformed Soviet Federation, but it was too little, too late. The centrifugal forces unleashed by glasnost and perestroika were tearing the Union apart. The economic reforms of perestroika were slow to yield results and often led to further shortages, inflation, and economic chaos, exacerbating public discontent and undermining Gorbachev's popularity. The political reforms of glasnost, while liberating, also unleashed forces that Gorbachev could no longer control, empowering nationalist movements and democratic opposition. Hardline communists, fearing the complete collapse of the Soviet system and their own power, grew increasingly alarmed by Gorbachev's reforms and the growing power of Boris Yeltsin, the populist leader of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, who advocated for greater Russian sovereignty. In August 1991, a group of hardline communist officials, known as the Gang of Eight, including the head of the KGB, the Minister of Defense, and the Vice President, launched a coup attempt. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest in Crimea and declared a state of emergency, attempting to restore the old order. However, the coup quickly faltered. Boris Yeltsin, demonstrating immense courage, stood atop a tank outside the Russian White House in Moscow, rallying public resistance and defying the coup leaders. The army largely refused to obey the coup leaders' orders, and within 3 dramatic days, the coup collapsed due to popular opposition and military disloyalty. The failed August coup proved to be the death knell for the Soviet Union. It fatally undermined the authority of the Communist Party, which was subsequently banned in Russia, and accelerated the disintegration of the Union. Republic after republic, seeing the central government's weakness, declared full independence. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia Boris Yeltsin, Ukraine Leonid Kravchuk, and Belarus Stanislav Shushkevich met in Belovezh Forest and declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States (CIS) in its place. This was done without Gorbachev's knowledge or approval. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, having no state left to lead, resigned as President of the Soviet Union in a televised address. A few hours later, the Soviet flag, with its iconic hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin flagpole for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The next day, December 26, 1991, the Supreme Soviet, the highest legislative body, formally dissolved itself, officially ending the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. After 74 years, a grand, ambitious, and often brutal experiment in building a communist society had come to an end, reshaping the global geopolitical landscape forever. Conclusion: a legacy of contradictions. The fall of the Soviet Union was one of the most significant geopolitical events of the 20th century. It marked the definitive end of the Cold War, the collapse of a global ideological rival to the West, and the emergence of 15 independent nations from its former territory, each embarking on its own complex path. The world moved from a bipolar order to a unipolar one, at least for a time. The legacy of the Soviet Union is one of profound and enduring contradictions. It was a state that championed the rights of the working class and peasantry, promising equality and liberation from exploitation, yet it subjected its own people to unimaginable suffering through purges, forced famines, forced migrations, and a vast system of forced labor camps. It achieved monumental industrial and scientific feats, transforming a largely agrarian society into a modern industrial power and being the first to put a satellite and a human in space, yet its centrally planned economy ultimately stagnated, failed to innovate, and struggled to provide even basic consumer goods for its citizens. Its scientific endeavors, while impressive, were sometimes marred by ideological interference and ethical compromises, and its environmental record was catastrophic. It played a decisive and heroic role in defeating Nazism, bearing the brunt of the fighting in World War II, yet it also imposed its will on Eastern Europe, suppressed dissent within its borders, and engaged in widespread human rights abuses and pervasive state secrecy. For some, particularly in the West, it remains a powerful symbol of a failed utopian dream, a stark warning against the dangers of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and centralized control. For others, particularly those who experienced its social safety nets, its sense of collective purpose, and its global standing, its passing is viewed with a complex mix of nostalgia and regret, a loss of stability and national pride. The memory of the Soviet Union continues to be debated and reinterpreted, shaping political discourse and national identity in its successor states. The story of the Soviet Union is a testament to the power of ideas, the resilience of people in the face of immense hardship, and the unpredictable, often violent, currents of history. Its rise and fall continue to shape the world we live in today, a complex and enduring reminder of a 74-year experiment that changed the course of human events forever. If you enjoyed this journey through history, Please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more compelling narratives.